Hello. Is everybody here? I think we're still missing someone, or maybe one or two people. I think there's 8 people in this class. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah. Well, maybe we'll wait a minute before we get started. But hello, this is the first evening of International Economics. And so if you look in Blackboard, you'll see that I've posted already the syllabus and some notes. So why don't we go take take a look over there? Hold on one second. Oh, sorry, over here. All right, where are we? Oh, here it is, International Finance, spring of 2021. So the syllabus is up here in the syllabus tab. Let's open that up. Now, this is the standard Manhattanville syllabus. And then as far as the notes are concerned, I've put them in here under course readings. So we've got chapter 13 here, and that, of course, will be followed by 14. Now, you might wonder why we're starting with chapter 13. Well, because the book that we're using, which is right here, International Economics by Krugman, Opsfeld, and Melitz, is actually a 2-part book, and which is pretty normal for international economics. The first half is usually dedicated to international trade, and the second half is usually where we see international finance. And so this book is no exception. It starts with trade, and then the second half is finance. Now, as far as I know, we're still at the 10th edition. Let me go take a look at Amazon for a second. Has anybody actually bought this book?
Yes, Professor, I bought the book.
Did you get the 10th
from
edition?
Amazon? Yes.
Okay, it was 10. All right, I'm a little surprised they haven't updated it recently. I mean, normally, I know from experience that almost all textbook authors ideally like to have a new book out every 2 or 3 years because they worry that people won't buy a book if it's perceived as being too old. But this one seems to still, well, or maybe they've gotten it up to 11, but that's okay. I'll tell you what, you can buy the 10th one because they don't really change very much from one edition to the next. They really don't. So yeah, what they'll do is maybe add some tiny little new thing and then slap a new cover on it, and all of a sudden it's the 11th edition. So no, if you got the 10th, that's perfect. I was just wondering what's taking so long. Yeah, it's a very competitive market, and if you don't keep updating it every so often, you're going to have a problem. But this is the one you've got, right? Okay. Now, the only reason that matters is because I want to make sure that the chapter numbers are the same. This is one annoying things about new textbooks. What often ends up happening is that they'll change the numbering of the chapter slightly, and then all of a sudden I have to fix them all. So I'm pretty sure that they haven't changed the numbering scheme. Chapter 13 should still be the first chapter in the second half of the book, which is about international finance. The first 12 chapters should be the discussion about international trade, which we will not be doing in this class. Our focus here is international finance, so we'll be covering the second half of the book only. Now, it's a very good book, but it is a little densely written, in my opinion. So I've put slides that I've written on the Blackboard, which we'll be looking at every week as we go along through the notes. And this way I'm hoping to sort of bring it down to earth a little bit and show you exactly what they're talking about, and especially give you a lot of examples that'll make it that much easier. So it's a kind of book where some of the chapters, there's a lot of graphs involved, and some weeks there's a little bit more math involved. And there's always a certain amount of theory going on behind the scenes. But don't you worry, we'll be making sense of it very quickly, and we'll start to see very quickly how it applies to the real world. Every day in the news, a large percentage of the news is about finance and economics, especially international economics. And of course, there have been a lot of exciting developments in the international financial arena in the last 10, 20, 30 years. In particular, the creation of the euro in January 1999. And so, and of course, it's still thriving as far as we can tell. And so we've got this book that will help us make sense of it all. But also, I have this other book, which I really like, called Currency Wars. And this is more about currency crises that have taken place in the last 20 or 30 years. And so the thing is about international finance is that it does have an extremely interesting history, because every so often, currencies are often at the center of financial crises, especially international financial crises. And so you'll get an opportunity in this book to read about a lot of different historical episodes that have taken place and help put all of this in context. And at the end of the course, we're going to have you hand in a very short paper, which you are going to pick one of these topics and expand on it and write basically a short paper about any topic that you can find in this book, or really any other topic in international finance that happens to interest you. So we'll go over that a little bit later, but that's why this book is here. As far as I know, this one is on Amazon too. I don't think they've ever updated it. Let me just check that out. As far as I know, so it's probably very cheap by now, since it's been out for such a long time. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, it's like, oh, for God's sakes, it's $5.99 in Kindle now. It's 10 years old. I figured as much. It's not exactly a textbook. Let's see if I can look at the contents in the hardcover version. No, it's too old, I guess. But oh yeah, no, it's fine. Okay, here we go. So you can see that it's all about different currency events, like in between World War I and II, and the post-World War II world, and the G20, and all these other wonderful examples of international finance throughout history, which I'm sure you will find very interesting. Okay, but in the meantime, we're going to focus on the textbook, and we're just going to go through, I believe, all of the first chapters from 13 to, I think, 18. And we'll go through those, and that will be the content of the course. Now, since we're online, of course, we can't obviously do anything in person. So here's what I've done before. While all of this nonsense has been going on, what I basically did was we met every week. We had our lecture, of which, by the way, is being recorded, and you'll be able to get your hands on it when we're done if you want it. What I've been doing with it is this. In principle, I could put it on Blackboard, but I found it easier to do this. I have a YouTube account, and I have all these classes at different schools. And so what I've essentially done is organized everything into one account. And here they are. Now you can see there's a bunch of videos here that I've created for all my different classes at all my different schools. And so I've created a playlist for our class, which is Mfin 5501. And so as soon as we're done tonight, I'll be putting our recording in here somewhere. And you should be able to find it just by looking not so much through all the videos, but the playlist, which is designed to keep all of our videos separate from all the rest of them. And then you can go here and watch it anytime you feel like it. You can watch it or not watch it. That's up to you. If you've been to the class, you shouldn't really need to watch it, but you might feel like you want to review what we've gone over during the class. And so that's fine. And then this way, if you have to miss a class, you can always watch the recording. So it's not such a big deal as it would be during a normal semester, which to me is a big deal. I mean, that's awfully helpful. I'm wondering if when we go back in person again, we can figure out a way to keep recording these lectures, because I think this is an awfully good idea. How about your other classes? They're recording everything, right? Is anyone here in a class that's not being recorded? Oh,
Yeah, none of my classes are being recorded. This is the
really?
first class. Yeah.
No kidding. I wonder why not. Is the teacher shy? I don't know. I can't imagine what motivation they could have for not recording it, especially online. I mean, come on. There's going to be times when you're late because of work, or you can't come at all, or something goes wrong. I mean, really, I don't know. It just seems, I mean, it doesn't take any extra time to record it. And it's not like I'm giving you like all this content that's covered by copyright laws or anything. This is my work. I'm giving you my materials, and that's it. And you can have it. And if you want it, it's there. So, all right. Anyway, so that's where it's going to be found. So, oh yeah, and if you, when you come to YouTube, you can find me very quickly and easily. Just type in my name, and it'll take you right to my account, I assume. And there I am. And come over here now. Go to the playlists, and it should be in here somewhere. It isn't listed there now because we don't have any videos just yet. But when I put the first one up, you'll see it in here with all the other ones. All right. I don't know. I'm pretty sure you'll have access to all of the other ones, which if you want to watch the videos from my other classes, that's fine with me. I have statistics in here, and I have pre-calculus, and I have basic macroeconomics, and a lot of other fun stuff. So if you feel like it, you can go right ahead and watch my other videos too. I might end up with more than 2 viewers that way. So anyway, all right, so this is where the videos are being kept. And so what else do you need to know? Well, this is a very long syllabus. It has all these great details, but bottom line is the class meets on Thursday nights, starting at 7 o'clock. We're going to run through May. I believe we're going to end up with 12 meetings. I don't think there's any days off. I think that was done by design. And so we're going to cover the textbook, I think 6 or 7 chapters. And then we're going to do the currency wars. And as far as the grading goes, it'll be a combination. Basically, I'll give you problem sets to work on at home based on the material we're covering. There's a paper, like I said, for currency wars, and then we'll have a midterm and a final, which you'll be doing at home and sending back to me. The rest of this is, Manhattanville stuff. I didn't write any of this. This is theirs. Oh, but yes, here we go. There is a schedule here, which is kind of nice. And so these are the topics that we'll be looking at. And, this gives you a rough idea of what to expect. And this is pretty much what we'll be doing. I mean, obviously, some weeks we might get a little ahead of ourselves. We might get a little behind, but I think this is a pretty reasonable schedule. So, all right, well, that's that. And all right, so now I always like to ask questions like this at the beginning of the class. First of all, does anybody here have any economics background? Now, by the way, you don't even have to verbally answer. I have the capability here, as you can see here, of creating polls. So I'm going to do this right now. And when I say background, I mean like maybe a little bit in high school or maybe a course in college. So let me just do this as a poll. And you can see how much fun this is. Okay, and so it's going to be just yes or no. Now, of course, this can be a bit of a vague question. There's a bit of gray area, but let's just see what everyone has to say for themselves. Whoops, what just happened? Okay, I think it just deleted what I did. No, wait a minute. No, I think it lost it. Well, that's what I needed. All right, we'll try it again. All right, so it should pop up in your screen. And let's take a shot at this. Oh, that was quick. Okay, so most of you have some background. Now, I'm not going to assume that you have any particular background, but I'll make sure that we review as necessary. For example, concepts like supply and demand, which will show up periodically. I'll make sure that we review everything as we go along because the class itself, I don't believe has any prerequisites. So I don't want anybody to be at a disadvantage, but it does it gives me important information to see that most of you do have some background. That's good. All right, wonderful. So now, what else should we do tonight? Oh, I know. How about if we go look at the materials? So what we're going to be looking at here tonight is we're going to start chapter 13. And let me get that open for you. Here we go. So it's right here. We can open it up and download it, chapter 13. Now, this discussion that we're looking at here is the only topic that you'll be looking at in this course that's really more accounting than anything else. And I don't mean like traditional accounting, but it's more about how do we keep track of our international transactions? How do we classify them? How does the government keep track of this information? After this, it becomes more theoretical, more like a true finance or economics course. And we'll be doing a lot of graphs, like I said, and there'll be a lot of interesting real world discussions. So this chapter is a little bit more accounting oriented, but it also introduces a lot of important concepts that you need to be familiar with. All right. So anyway, and by the way, if you want to find yourself catching up and reading about this stuff in the news, let me just show you a couple of good places to go. There's a website called cnbc.com, which is very helpful for finding anything you want to know about what's going on in finance or economics. In fact, look at all these topics they have here. For example, currencies. Oh, okay. Well, you know what? I was hoping to see articles, but I'm seeing exchange rate quotes here. We will need this as we go along. Believe me, we'll spend a lot of time talking about exchange rates. But all right, let's see what else we can find here. Okay. No, all right. Well, maybe not so much. All right, but this is a good website because it has a lot of important information here. And if you want to read longer articles about international finance, one of the best places is this magazine called The Economist, which is a British publication. So they spend a lot of time talking about international issues. And for example, let's see what we can find today. Let's see if I wanted to read up about what's going on with the dollar. Okay, so yes, there's all kinds of wonderful articles here about international finance. And what's great about this, The Economist, is that it's meant for non-specialists. In other words, it's not overwhelmingly technical. It's meant for people just who may not have any background in this area, but who are interested in studying it. And so they keep the math to an absolute minimum, which is not always the case. And they try to really explain what they're talking about instead of assuming that you know what they're saying, like maybe the Wall Street Journal has a tendency to do that. So I think you'll find this to be interesting. If you're really interested in studying more about international finance, this is a great place to look. And now here's something we're going to look at later on in the course, the Big Mac Index of global currencies. This is an amusing thing they've been doing for about 20 years now, where they try to create an index which will explain to you how strong the dollar is based on the price of the Big Mac in countries throughout the world. And so even though it was meant as a joke when they started doing this, every year people look forward to it because it actually does have some interesting insights that we can think about as far as the strength of the dollar goes. So we'll get to that later on. Other than that, there's typically many different articles you can read here. And there's also the more specialized journals that you can look at. You can look at British newspapers and publications because they tend to have more international finance articles than American papers, just because it's in Europe. Trade is a much bigger percentage of their economies than it is in the United States. So it matters a great deal to them. And of course, they're all right next to each other. And so they do trade a lot with each other. So as in Europe, trade is a much bigger topic than it might be in the United States. So, and if I think of any other sources, I will let you know. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of fun and interesting. And the more you read, the more you can make sense out of what's going on. And you'll probably notice in the regular mainstream news, that a large percentage of everyday's news is ultimately economics or finance. Who else has a lot of good stuff about international? Sometimes Bloomberg does. Let's see, what do we have going on here? They have their quotes, but yeah, maybe not this. Yeah, I guess if you really want the articles, you have to go to a specialized website like The Economist. But yeah, you might find this interesting. The only thing is you got to watch out for The Economist. They're going to push hard to get you to subscribe. So if you look at it too often, you may end up having to either stop reading it or else pay them. Like the Wall Street Journal now, you can't read a lot of their articles unless you're subscribing, which is very unfortunate, but that's the way it is. All right, so let's take a look at what we're doing tonight. This is the so-called national income accounting and the balance of payments. Now, the balance of payments is something you're likely to have heard of in the news because this is where we measure how large our trade deficit is. And as you probably know, the US typically has a trade deficit every year, which means that we're importing more goods from abroad than we're selling to them. Now, I just thought of a good opportunity to have another poll. So when we owe more money to foreigners than they owe to us, we call that a trade deficit. When it's the other way around, we call that a surplus. So here's my question to you, and this might be amusing. Trade deficits. Here we go. When was the last time that the US had a trade surplus? Okay, so here we go. Let's say, all right, that should do it. Just out of curiosity. No, not that one. Let's try, yeah. Either you know or you don't. There's no shame in this one. Ooh, some of you are still thinking about it. Now, it's no fair if you go to your phone and ask it to, this is supposed to be from your own knowledge. All right, well, guess what? The majority of you are absolutely correct. 1991, 30 years since our last trade surplus. That's pretty embarrassing, isn't it? Yeah, it hasn't been quite so long as 1776. That's pushing it a little. But that's right. The US routinely has trade deficits year in and year out. And some of those years, it's been as much as close to like $900 billion in a single year, which is a lot of money for even the US. Now, if you want to get the actual numbers for some reason, here's what you can do. There's a very nice website that has all kinds of wonderful economics and financial data. It's free. It is called FRED. It stands for Federal Reserve Economic Database. It's run at the St. Louis Fed, and it has all kinds of economic data. So what I'm going to do is ask Fred to show me U.S. trade deficits, and it's going to come back here. And ooh, look at this. Now, this is a chart, a graph. If I want a chart, let's see, what do I do? Anyway, so you can see it almost, this is going back to about 1991. The deficit, look what's happening to it. Right about here, it peaked out at about, let's see, oh, no, something's not, oh, this is monthly. I didn't even notice that. I'd rather have it on yearly. Let's go back for a second. Yeah, let's look at this. Annual. Oh, they've got everything here. but let's go with this one. Okay, now I'd like to go back. Oh, ooh, I wonder how far back you can go. It says max here. Yeah, and that's not a very pretty graph, is it? Let's see what we can do. Let's download this into Excel. Okay, it only goes back 10 years, unfortunately. All right, let's make our own graph. All right, let's see what kind of graph we can create here. I guess that'll do. Now, what I'd like you to notice here is the size of these numbers. Now, remember, this is only going back to 2009. Let's say right here, that's about $455 billion. These are in billions. So that means that's $500 billion in just 1 year. Okay, so this is a lot of money, even for the United States. So every year we owe hundreds and hundreds of billions more dollars to foreigners. Last year in 2019, it was about $500 billion. And along this period, it's never gotten much below $336 billion. Oh, here we go. Now this one is going back to 1991. No, it actually isn't. What's going on here? Wonder what's wrong with this thing. Yeah, see, this one is fine, but it's monthly. I think it's easier to look at it in yearly terms. But anyway, you get the picture. We have the data here, and you can see it's not looking good. And so we want to, later on in the course, we'll start to ask ourselves questions like, how is this happening and what effect does it have on the economy? In this chapter, we just want to capture what information is being kept in these accounts and how does that add up to such a large deficit? Where is the money going and where is it coming from? That's what we'd like to know. So we're looking ultimately at the total output of goods and services in an economy plus our international transactions. So we're getting involved here in something called national income accounting, which is an attempt by the government to measure the value of all of our output of goods and services during a given year. Okay, it's important to keep track of this information because it's really the only way we can find out if our standards of living are growing over time, right? And so the government, one thing that it actually is good at is keeping track of statistics. This is something governments love to do, and that's gather up numbers. Now, luckily for us, all of this information is available on these different websites for free. There are several different government agencies that are responsible for gathering up this data. So in this particular case, we're looking at the Department of Commerce, specifically the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So if I go back there and say, all right, listen, oh, okay, what's going on? I wonder if they changed their website. Let's go for, it's 2020. We could technically get 2020, but it's probably not available yet. It's only February. It usually takes about 3 months to completely finish analyzing the end of the previous year. So let's take a look at this. So this is a brief overview. And you can see in 2019, the blue is exports and the orangey color is imports. Now here it looks like they're really close to each other, but the reality is that's about $500 billion. It doesn't look like it, but the gap between the two is about $500 billion. And you can see this is pretty much what we've been experiencing for the last so many years, all the way back to 2009. sorry, 1991. So this is just a brief summary. What I'd really like to do is get a hold of the spreadsheet where all the data is kept. Let's see where we can find that. I'd like to see the latest numbers. See where they have hidden it. 2019 table, let's say. Yeah, see, this is still just this summary. I know somewhere on this website, oh, maybe it's over here. This might be it. Okay, this is it. Oh. Oh boy. Well, it's nice to have all this analysis, but I want the actual spreadsheet. Ooh, tables only. Ooh, this might be it. This is as of December 2020. So let's see what they've given us. Okay, so let's look at the tabs. This might be it. This might be what we're looking for. Okay, so this is it. This is what we needed. All right, so we're going to be analyzing this tonight. So why don't we're going to focus our attention, let's say in 2019. And so everything we need to know about U.S. international transactions is in this table. And we're going to look at all these different categories and try to make sense out of them and understand what they're trying to tell us with this chart, or the spreadsheet, I should say. Okay. So we don't need this anymore. All right, so I'm going to save this to my hard drive real fast so I can post it on Blackboard. And then you'll be able to look at it yourselves, but we're going to go over this tonight. And by the time we're done, we'll know what all of these entries mean and what they tell us about the state of our international position. And so hold on one second. So this is U.S. Oh, this is chapter 13. U.S. trade. I'll just call it U.S. balance of payments. Uh, 2019, let's say. That should do it. All right, very good. All right, so what exactly is going on here? Now, it looks like a lot. We don't need to look at every single one of these categories. We're really just interested in the broad categories, which we'll analyze as we go along. Now, first thing I want to point out to you is that here we're looking at millions of dollars. So that gives you a sense of the magnitude of some of these numbers. Like this one, exports of goods and services and income receipts, that number, 3,792,867, when multiplied by a million, comes back as $3.79 trillion. Okay, so remember, these are enormous sums of money. 3.79, just under $3.8 trillion. That's a lot of money. Now, does anyone have a rough idea what the size of the entire U.S. economy is? Is that a large number compared to the size of the economy? All right, well, I'll give you a hint. Well, it's roughly around $20 trillion. So even though our exports are a lot of money, this is a big chunk of change. Compared to the size of the entire economy, we're looking at, let's say about less than 20% of our output is coming from these exports that we sell to foreigners. By Western European standards, that's next to nothing. Many of those countries, half or more of their GDP or national output is coming from exports. So it's much more important to European countries than the United States, where this accounts for no more than 20% of the size of the economy. It's still important, but not nearly as important as this for countries like, let's say, England or France or Germany, and especially in Asia, where a lot of those countries earn even more of their GDP from exports. All right, so let's get back to the slides. Now, by the way, I do want to mention, and this is something we have to point out about this book, there's two different ways that national output can be measured. Now, national output is to a country what your annual income is to an individual. It's the dollar value of all the goods and services that are being produced by that country during a given calendar year. But there's two equivalent, more or less, ways of measuring it. GNP, which stands for gross national product, as you can see, and GDP, which stands for gross domestic product. Now, here's one of the quirky things about this book. Most books at this point in time always talk about gross domestic product. This book, for whatever reason, is still sticking with gross national product. So we're going to see throughout the course how these two are different from each other. Now, it turns out that for the United States, these two are very, very close to each other. The numerical difference is typically less than 0.5%. But there's a lot of small countries where the difference can be quite considerable. Now, they have their reasons for doing this, but I just want to mention that if you read any article out there about the economy, almost without fail, they're going to refer to it as GDP, but just be aware this book likes to use GNP. Okay, now here's the distinction between the two. GNP refers to the output, by which I mean final goods and services that are meant for consumers, produced by the citizens of a country, regardless of where they're located. Whereas GDP tells us how much was produced within the borders of the country, regardless of what citizenship they have. So you can see the distinction here between citizens versus location. So just as a few quick examples, if Ford is producing cars in the UK, which they are for the UK market, the value of those cars would be counted in our GNP because it's an American company, but not our GDP because the cars are being built in England or the UK. All right, does that make sense to everyone? Okay, well, I guess that means yes. All right. Now, how about this example? From the UK perspective, these cars are included in the UK's GDP because they're being built in the UK, but not in the GNP because it's not a British company. All right. Now, how about this one? You know that Japanese companies often build their cars in the United States, the ones that are meant for the US market, because the cost of shipping cars from Japan would be very, very expensive. So they build them here for the ones that are meant for the US market. So those cars, because they're Japanese cars, but they're built in the United States, they're being included in our GDP, but not our GNP, okay? GDP because they're being built in the United States, but not GNP because this is not an American company. Okay, now, from the perspective of the Japanese, those cars are being counted in Japanese GNP because it's a Japanese company, but they're not including it in the GDP because it's not being built in Japan. All right, does everyone get it? I mean, so, we'll run into this from time to time in this course. We just want to remind ourselves periodically, what is the difference between these two measures? Now, neither one of them is a better measure. They both capture slightly different things, and you'll see as we go along how that works. All right. Now, GDP, gross domestic product. We're going to start with GDP and see how it is measured. And we'll see that GDP is subdivided into four very broad categories. All goods and services that are produced are considered to fall into one of these four categories. And we'll explain these in a little bit more detail in the next few slides, but these are the four basic categories. We have personal consumption expenditures, as you can see, gross private domestic investment, and you see these letters. We often use the letters in our equations to help us, understand what's going on without having to write out the words every time. We have government expenditures, and then finally we have net exports of goods and services, which will be especially important in a course like this. That's right. This is the one that we'll be focused on most often because this is an international finance course. All right, so that leaves open the question, what kinds of items belong in each of these categories? Well, some of it is pretty self-explanatory, and some of these will probably surprise you. Okay, and maybe you won't be shocked, but you might be surprised when you learn about what items belong in each of these categories. And by the way, that's also being done here. If you look carefully, you'll see that we have all this in here somewhere, but it may not be laid out exactly the same way you're seeing here. Everything is in here somewhere, though. Okay, so all right, so let's look at these one at a time. And in each case, we want to understand not only what factors or variables are in these categories, but how are they affected by different variables in the economy, like interest rates, inflation rates, exchange rates, and that type of thing. Right, so personal consumption expenditures, these are goods and services that are bought by individuals, consumers, or as we call them in economics, households. All right, a household can consist of a single person or several people in the family, but these are individuals. So here, in a general sense, we can break up the two categories. Services are just services. Services mean that you are doing something useful, but no physical product is being produced. Like, for example, for a lawyer provides legal services. Okay. And when you leave a lawyer's office, you don't have a physical good with you, but you do have, let's say, a will or some other legal service. Goods, though, on the other hand, are tangible items. And we break those down into two very basic categories. As you can see, we have durables and non-durables. Okay, well, the name durable should give you a hint as to what that means. All right, so in general, what does the word durable mean?
I would say something that lasts.
Exactly, and that's exactly what these are meant to be. The non-durable ones that are consumed very quickly. So here's some good examples of this. Durable goods, officially, according to the government's accounts, are meant to last 3 or more years. So here we see big ticket items like autos and furniture and appliances and other expensive items that are meant to last for a long time. Now, the one thing they do all have in common with each other is that they're, first of all, a couple of things. First of all, they're very expensive, which means how are they typically financed? Do you pay for these with cash?
Probably some payments.
Right, either a bank loan or a consumer line of credit from the store. Like if you buy a car, for example, at General Motors, they'll have their own financing arm called General Motors Acceptance Corporation, and they will do whatever it takes to get you the money to buy one of their cars. Okay, unless your credit is an absolute disaster, they'll do what it takes to get that car to you, because that's where they make their money, not by financing it, but by you buying that car. But the rest of them could be bought with something like, let's say, just a simple credit card. And so what's interesting about durable goods is that the demand for these goods depends very heavily on the state of the economy. So, for example, if interest rates are going up, that makes it much more difficult to finance these types of goods. And you tend to see a slump in the demand for durable goods. Or if people are worried about losing their jobs, you don't want to buy a new car when you're about to get laid off, do you? Absolutely not. You're going to make that old car last a little bit longer if you're really worried about your job. So, the reason why this is an important category is because when people start to get nervous about the state of the economy, this is where it shows up first, in a slump in the demand for durable goods. That's usually taken as a bad sign by economists that people are losing confidence. That's a very big problem because that may mean that a recession is on the way. Okay, so economists pay very close attention to the sales of durable goods, again, because it's a signal to the markets as to how much confidence consumers have in the immediate future. On the other hand, the so-called non-durable goods are the ones that we buy on a regular basis because they have very short lifetimes. We need to eat, we need to wear clothes, we need to get to work. So when with these goods, they're very inexpensive compared to durables. So the demand doesn't really fluctuate with the state of the economy. We keep buying food. Now, you may try to cut them back a little if you're about to lose your job, but you're not going to stop buying food just because, you're about to lose your job. It's not going to happen. So the demand for these products is more or less independent of the state of the economy. So that's one of the reasons why the government breaks up these goods into these two separate categories, because the demand for these goods behaves very differently depending on the state of the economy. And of course, all services are the same. It's a case where somebody does something useful for you, but there is no physical product. Okay, now, how about the second category, gross private domestic investment? That's a lot, but we can abbreviate that I for investment. And this consists of three broad categories. And one of them might surprise you. Right at the top of the list is residential investment, which is another name for the purchase of new housing. So if you notice, this is not in the consumer spending category. This is defined as an investment. So do you think that's a good idea? Does it make sense to you? Isn't it really a consumer good?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, a house is meant to last a lifetime, isn't it?
Hmm.
Even beyond. It's dreadfully expensive, and but it's a terrific investment too. So I think this kind of makes sense, even though it is kind of a consumer good. It's such a long-term purchase and something you'll use for a long time that it could be thought of as a type of investment. Now, non-residential or business investment, this is where businesses buy, let's say, they invest in new equipment, they buy computers, they buy new buildings. In other words, these are products that are being purchased not for their own sake, but in order to make it possible for businesses to produce consumer goods and services. So, like a Starbucks, if they buy new blenders, that goes into this category. Whereas if I, as an individual, buy a blender, it ends up here under consumer goods because I'm not using it to make money and I'm not a business. So sometimes the goods themselves can end up in multiple categories depending on who's buying them and for what reason. Okay, but anything that's bought for the express purpose of producing goods and services could be defined as non-residential or business investment. Now, change in private inventories, this is an interesting category because what often happens is for certain types of merchandise, it can take a long time to sell them. So imagine you're General Motors and you build a bunch of new cars in December, but they're not sold until January. Now, remember, our goal is to keep track of what happened within a given calendar year. So what do we do with those new cars? Do we push them into the following year? No. What we do is, because they haven't been sold yet, we're going to count them in the separate category called change in private inventories. So their value is being captured not as a sale, but as an increase in the value of our inventories. So that's why the category is there, because it's a recognition that even when we produce goods and services, it can take time to sell them. But we want the value of those goods to be included in the year in which they were produced, not in the year they were sold. So therefore, we need this category to cover things that were built but not sold in a given year. Now, along with durable goods spending, this is another category that tends to be very, very sensitive to the state of the economy. That's why economists pay so much attention to it. If private inventories are shrinking, it may very well be that businesses are nervous. They're not confident about the future. And that could also be a sign of an impending recession. So that's why this category is so closely watched. Now, that may not be what the problem is. It may be that these companies have simply overbuilt in the past and they're trying to make up for it now. But still, this is often seen as a very bad sign. All right, so these are three of the most important categories. And also, all three of them have one thing in common. They're heavily influenced by the level of interest rates. Why would that be, do you think?
Higher interest, less people will take loans for the.
That's right. Exactly. That's right. When interest rates are high, that's not the time to buy a new house, is it? Or to build up some more investment. Like if you're Starbucks and interest rates are very high, it's going to cost you a lot of money to finance any investments you may make. And inventories as well. You're not going to build as many products because you're worried that they'll sit on the shelves for a long time. So high interest rates have a negative impact on this gross private domestic investment category. And that's true too here with durable goods. So you know what? This is one of the reasons why interest rates have such a profound effect on the economy, and why monetary policy, which we'll discuss later on, has such an immediate impact on the economy. Uh, as you may know, the Federal Reserve System is responsible for carrying out monetary policy, and so they've got to be very, very careful when they decide what to do with interest rates, because the impact can be enormous. And by the way, it doesn't show it here, but durable goods account for about 2/3 of GDP, and private investment is about 15 to 20%. So anything that affects both of those categories is going to have a huge impact on the economy. So interest rates are a huge, huge deal when it comes to their impact on the economy. Now, the third category is government. Now, here we have to be careful. We're not looking at all the money the government spends. We're only looking at actual purchases of goods and services. So when they, no matter what they buy it for example, if the government decides to buy new computers for the Pentagon, that goes into this category. Whoops. Defense. Or if they buy, let's say they decide to reupholster all the seats in Congress because they're getting really worn out, and they say, oh, those guys deserve nicer cushions. That would be non-defense spending. We also have state and local spending, but here we want to only capture the purchase of actual goods and services, not what we call transfer payments. All right, actual goods and services. By the way, who knows what that means, a transfer payment? No, nobody knows? Okay, What about Social Security? If the government sends you a check for Social Security, are they buying something? No, they're basically just transferring money from one part of the government to your pocket. So we do not count that because now I, as the recipient, I'm likely to go out and spend it on a lot of consumer goods. So we don't want to count that money twice. Right? That's exactly what would happen if we counted the value of these Social Security payments and the money that I spend on consumer goods. So we leave those out to avoid what's called double counting. That could be a real problem. In fact, because the numbers themselves, getting this right is a real headache. As you can probably imagine, with an economy of this size, getting these numbers right is a huge problem. And so they have to do whatever it takes to keep everything accurate. And so one of the many things they have to do is to avoid including transfer payments, because then they're going to count those payments twice, and the economy will appear to be much bigger than it really is. Okay, so just remember, with government spending, we're only thinking about goods and services. Now, also, what's interesting here is that unlike consumer goods and investment spending, which are heavily dependent on interest rates, these government expenditures are really undertaken for political reasons rather than economic reasons. So we assume that they're just constant. In other words, higher interest rates would not affect government expenditures. A stronger dollar would not likely affect those expenditures because they're being undertaken for non-economic reasons. Whereas consumer spending, consumers are clearly trying to maximize the value of their dollars, and investment spending, businesses are trying to maximize their profits. Whereas with government, it's a very different ballgame. All right, now here's the last category, and this is the one that we're going to spend a lot of time with in this course, of course, because we're looking at international finance, and that would be net exports. Now, it says here net, which means we're subtracting something from something else. We'll see what that is in a second, but first of all, both imports and exports can be classified as goods and services. Okay, that makes sense. And net exports means the dollar value of our exports minus our imports. And in the popular press, this is often referred to as the trade balance. This is what it actually means: the difference between the value of our exports and the value of our imports. Okay, now, why don't we take a quick look at our printout here and see what our deficit was. According to this chart here, our deficit for 2019 was in the neighborhood of $480 billion. But let's look at here. We've got the exports of goods and services, roughly $2.5 trillion, which they then further break down into goods, about 1.6, or let's say $1.7 trillion, and services are about 860 billion. And now income receipts, we'll discuss that in a few minutes. And then we have imports of goods and services, about $3.1 trillion. So guess what? If I take that number and subtract it from this number, let me put this over here somewhere. Trade deficit make that a little bigger so you can see it. How much is that? This, by the way, this first column is 2018. That's okay. Well, we can use that one. 2018 trade deficit, therefore, would have been about, let's see, good exports of goods and services minus imports of goods and services, about, no, it's almost $600 billion. Huh. That sounds like a lot of money, doesn't it? But that's pretty normal for the United States, at least in the last couple of decades. That's pushing up towards $600 billion in 1 year. Okay, now if you want to break it down further, all the categories are right here. If this interests you, and you can see exactly where these numbers are coming from. Wow. And they've got all these categories like transportation and travel and construction and insurance and financial and industrial supplies and food and all the rest. There's even a category for gold. You notice how it says non-monetary gold? That means it's probably being used for jewelry or something along those lines. And US, let's face it, the US does produce gold, mainly in Alaska, and it's being exported here to foreigners, most likely for industrial uses or possibly for jewelry. All right. Imports, it's pretty much the same categories. It's just that the imports are more than the exports. And now we'll see later on that there's a lot of reasons for this. But it turns out not all the reasons are bad reasons. It's not the case. Now, think about this. If the products that we made were so awful that nobody wanted to buy them, that would be a pretty terrible thing for our economy. And that would lead to a trade deficit. But what if it's not the problem? What if that's not what this is all about? Here's the issue with trade deficits, and we'll discuss this in much more detail later on. So trade deficits can arise if a country's products are not competitive, by which I mean they're either not very good, or maybe they're too expensive, or the country can't make them very easily, and so they're too expensive. But another possibility is this: trade deficits can arise if a country is growing rapidly and therefore buys a large volume of foreign products. So in other words, it could just be the case that we're so wealthy that in the process of buying all these goodies that we want from abroad, we're going to end up with it. This is especially true if the economies of our trade partners are struggling. So in other words, if, for example, maybe we have a huge deficit with respect to France, and it may just be that our economy is growing faster than theirs is. And so, of course, Americans buy more French goods than the French buy American goods. And if that's the case, then while, yes, we have a big deficit, at least it's caused by rapid growth, which may not be the worst thing in the world. Okay. So we have to take a closer look. It's not enough to say, wow, this is a disaster. We have to understand why these deficits arise in the first place. Now, another thing that can be causing this is that trade deficits can arise if the domestic currency is very strong. And again, we're going to discuss this later on in the, I forgot what chapter, but if the dollar is extremely strong, that by itself could be enough reason for this to happen. And in fact, we saw a lot of this in the 80s. The economy in the 80s was just booming along. The dollar got crazy strong. And so a lot of American manufacturers ran into trouble because foreigners couldn't afford to buy our products. And that can also be a potential source of trade deficits. So it's really only this case that we are terribly worried about. If people won't buy our products because they're not very good, that means we have a real problem on our hands. But if these are the issues, then this could turn itself around as our partners start to grow, and or if our dollar starts to depreciate. But it is still a big number any way you look at it. Maybe not so much compared to the size of the economy, but it is a big number. And by the way, and this is something we'll be seeing in these statements, how do we finance these deficits? We borrow from foreigners. Now, Fortunately, many of these countries are willing to, in effect, lend us the money at very low rates of interest to finance these purchases. For example, like that around this time of the year, a lot of retail stores start having big sales. Like Macy's, they traditionally have their so-called white sale at this time of the year, where they try to get you to come in the store and buy a lot of expensive items like furniture and other stuff. How do they get you in the door? What exactly do they use as an incentive to come in and buy furniture in February?
Heavily discounted items.
Cheap financing. They often will say in their ads, hey, guess what? If you come in here and buy a bunch of furniture in February, you won't have to pay any interest for 2 years or whatever it is. It's some very generous terms that they typically offer. And so they're saying, listen, we're going to make things easy for you. We're going to let you buy all this wonderful merchandise and take your sweet time about paying for it. Why? Because they make more money by selling you merchandise, even if it means giving you cheap financing, which really is coming out of their pocket. And so a country like China is kind of in the same boat. It's almost like everything they have is on sale, and they're practically begging us to buy it all. And so we turn around and say, sure, no problem. And they offer us cheap financing. And that's how this works. They're giving us merchandise at low prices with cheap financing, and we're basically taking advantage of it. And so this is one of the reasons why we owe so much money. In fact, the majority of the debt, I believe, is with China, although we can look that up. And that's part of the reason for that. Now, eventually, as China's economy grows, they'll become more affluent and they'll turn around and buy a lot of American products that they're not buying now. And as that's happening, these deficits will slowly take care of themselves. But in the meantime, year in, year out, we're going to find ourselves with these massive deficits. Okay, so anyway, so it's a very controversial area, trade deficits, and the press treats them as like, oh my God, what's going on here? But you'll notice if you look at the numbers, in fact, why don't we go back here? Our trade deficits tend to be the smallest when the economy is in the worst shape. So is that a good thing? If the economy shrinks because we're in a crisis, is that a good thing? No, of course not. So we should not assume that this number necessarily means that there is a problem with the economy. It may be that the number is so large because the economy is doing very well. So we have to take all this information with a grain of salt. All right. Now, anyway, having said all that, let's just see if there's anything else here we want to look at before we look at the GDP identity. I just want to identify a few key items here. For example, primary income receipts. We'll see more about that later on. When they say income, they basically are talking about a couple of basic things. If I'm an American and I decide to work in France and I send my wages back to the United States, that's defined as an income receipt for the United States because funds are flowing out of France into the United States. So I'm actually helping reduce the deficit by doing that. I may also own French stocks, and any profits I make from those stocks are considered to be investment income. Also, what about if I set up a business in France and I earn profits and bring them back to the United States? That all counts as an income receipt. So these are all going to count, and you'll see these help reduce the size of our trade deficit. But that's what income, when they say the word income here, they mean primarily income from investments, profits from businesses, and wages from working. All right. What else do we have here you should know about? Down here we have flows for financial reasons, like when you actually buy foreign stocks and bonds, that flow goes into these categories down here. Okay. And then there's some other miscellaneous, like monetary gold. You can see it says zero. We've been off the gold standard for quite a good long time. but occasionally central banks might make transactions with monetary gold. And when they say monetary, they mean the gold bars that are often converted into coins or were previously used as a form of money, to distinguish it from industrial gold, which is meant for things like jewelry and other products. All right, so we'll get back to these in a few minutes. So here we go. The GDP identity. Now, these letters just are used to represent what we had up here. For example, I have my four components are, here we go. Personal consumption expenditures, C. Gross private domestic investment, I. Government expenditures, G. And finally, net exports of goods and services, NX. Here I'm just bringing those together. And this identity or equation is called, oh God, where is it? The GDP identity. In other words, the left-hand side and the right-hand side have to match each other because this is how GDP has been defined. It's defined as spending on these four components. So the government measures how much do we pay for all these goodies that we bought during the year. And this is how they come up with the GDP. The logic being that if I spend money on new products, that generates incomes for the creators of these products. And either way, I'm capturing the value of what's been produced in the economy. All right, now we're going to do some algebra. So net income receipts, as I just finished discussing, consists primarily of wages paid to labor. We also have this category here, rent paid to land. That can mean a lot of things. Land in economics actually is used to mean natural resources. And the returns to land are defined as rent. It doesn't have to be literally rent like the rent on an apartment. It just means that if I'm, for example, the owner of an oil well, and ExxonMobil pays me $1 million a year for the right to use it, that would fall into this category because oil wells are a type of natural resource, and that falls into the category of land. And then profits paid to capital. Capital is basically physical goods and physical goods that are used to produce final consumer products. So like buildings. If I own a building and I'm renting it out to Starbucks, that goes into my pockets. And that goes into this category. All right. So now the idea here is this. Income can come into a country and it can go out. An American can earn wages in foreign countries. An American can buy foreign stocks and bonds, et cetera, et cetera. But foreigners can do the same thing here. So net income receipts mean how much money flows into the United States minus how much money flows out of the United States. The difference between the two is net income receipts. All right. Now, if we look at our spreadsheet again, we have primary income payments here. Let's see. We should have primary income receipts down here somewhere. Oh, maybe not. Where are they? Oh, here we are. Okay, so this is how much comes into the country, and this is how much goes out. So here we actually have a surplus. So let's figure out what it was. 2018 net income receipts. See, not all of these categories are deficits for the United States. The overall totals are, but some of the categories are surpluses, and this is usually one of them. So we're going to take the primary income that comes into the country and subtract the income that goes out of the country. And that would be, oh, look at this. We have a surplus of about $250 billion. Well, that's not bad. Not bad at all. We'll take it. All right. There you go. And remember, this is actually in millions. So this is 251 billion trillion dollars. No, that can't be right. $251 billion. Okay, so Here's some examples of how this works. So for now, if a US citizen owns a bond issued by the UK government, interest payments will flow from the UK government to the United States. Those payments are going to count in our GNP because this is considered to be an earning by an American citizen. But it's not going to count in GDP because it is not coming from the United States. In other words, this income was not generated in the borders of the United States. So in other words, these sources of income are being counted in GNP but not GDP. And this is what's really driving the difference between the two categories. Those income receipts. This is the primary difference between the two measures. Now, if we own a retail, let's say we start up a brand new Starbucks in Paris, the profits, again, would count in US GNP because that's flowing into the US and into the pockets of American citizens, but it didn't happen in the United States, so it doesn't count in US GDP. A British citizen owns a share of IBM stock and receives dividends. Now that money flows out of the US into the UK, so it has to be subtracted from US GNP. And again, remember, GNP is something that counts the citizenship, but not the location. It reduces GNP, but does not affect GDP. All right, here we go. One more, I think. Oh no, I guess not. So income paid by US citizens to American citizens increases our GNP, but does not affect our GDP. And income that we pay to foreigners reduces our GNP, but it does not affect our GDP. So if you're looking at GNP, it includes income receipts. GDP does not, because they're not generated in the United States. So therefore, we can define this new relationship between GDP and GNP. GNP is GDP plus net income receipts. So you can think of GNP as being a somewhat broader measure of our output than GDP. And this is maybe one of the reasons why this book prefers GNP to GDP. I don't know. I don't know the authors personally. I can't ask them. But they are still in the minority. Most books are using GDP. Now, it turns out, like I think I mentioned this before, in the United States, the two of them, depending on those net income receipts, GNP can be either greater than GDP, equal to, or less than. Now, in the case of the United States, you can see that our net income receipts are positive, which implies that US GNP is going to be greater than US GDP. All right, let me make that a lot bigger. Now, how much though? How much of a difference does it really make? Well, let's see. The US economy, US GDP, is approximately $20 trillion. Now, remember that we are actually treating all of these in millions. So basically what we're looking at here, let's see, how would I do that? Hold on one second. That would be this. Okay, because here I've written 20 million. If that's treated as millions of dollars, that actually works out to 20 trillion. Okay, now what percentage does this represent? So if GNP is therefore the sum of these two, Let's just say that that would be these two. Okay, you can see it's not that much of a difference. The percentage difference is going to be very small. How small, you ask? Let's find out. Okay, so what does that look like? This is 1.326%. So you can see why. I mean, for the US, it's a trivial difference. It almost doesn't matter which one we use to represent national income, which is what we usually do. But for many other countries, especially countries that have large deficits, the difference can be very, very considerable. So for the US, remember, it's not that big of a deal. Okay. Now, the balance of payments that we're looking at here is meant to be a record of all of our international transactions during a given year. Now, it says it on here somewhere. They actually call it the balance. No, it does say, oh no, I put that there. See, where do they actually refer to it that way? They actually don't use those terms. They call it the balance of international transactions or something like that, but it's typically referred to as the balance of payments. So we have a lot of things going on here. It's not just imports and exports. We have flows of investments like stocks and bonds, and occasionally we have transactions among central banks. And we'll discuss that further later on. But any types of gold transactions are typically going to be made between central banks, like the Fed and the central bank, let's say, of England. And oh, here's another link where you can find this information. We already have it. Now, the balance of payments is broken up into 4 basic sections. We have the current account, the capital account, which is really tiny. I don't know why they even bother with it. The financial account, and then here's an interesting one, the statistical discrepancy. It's kind of a fudge factor, but we'll discuss that in a few minutes. It's the kind of thing where if an accountant in a private company used it, he might find himself in a lot of hot water. But so what we're going to do is look at these one at a time, and we're going to match them up. You see right here, it says current account. You'll see that the current account is actually a broader idea or broader measure of our international trade, and because it basically incorporates the trade deficit with a few other items. We also have somewhere down here the capital account, which is really tiny. And then finally the financial account, which in effect is where these deficits up here are being financed. And then we have the good old statistical discrepancy. And let's see, how much does that work out to be? 34,165. In terms of millions, that's $34 billion. And finally, this right here is the balance in the so-called current account, of which, as we've already seen, this is the trade deficit. Right here. Sometimes it's hard to tell by the way they word this stuff, but we've already proved for ourselves negative 579, roughly negative 579, 937. This is what we mean by what the press popularly calls the trade deficit. It says balance on goods and services, but it is the trade deficit. Okay. So, all right. So it's good to know where all this stuff is held. By the way, if you want to look at more deeply at some of these categories, you can do it. All these tables are here. And you can see they're breaking all this stuff down into some very small categories. Wow, it's getting very specific, isn't it? All right, I'll tell you what. Before we dive into this, this is a very, as you know, this is a very, very long class. So we have to have a break in the middle somewhere. Normally I would have had it a little sooner, but I got carried away, I think. But we'll have a little break right now because I'm sure you could use some coffee or something. And when we get back, we'll start to discuss the current account and how it's measured. And then we'll take it from there. And at some point, we'll knock it off for the evening. And what you'll be able to do is read through these slides. And if you choose to do so, you can read through the book as well and see where we're going with all this wonderful information. And just keep in mind, starting with the next chapter, we're going to move away from this type of analysis into more theoretical discussions about trade, not so much trade, but the strength of the dollar and how it affects our trade balance. So, yeah, this will be the first and only chapter that really is truly more accounting than anything else. The rest of the time, we'll be looking at more financial and economic analysis. All right, so why don't we stop for about 10 minutes, and when we come back, we'll carry on with this, and we'll take it from there. All right, very good. Okay. All right, let's carry it on from here. Okay. So where were we? Oh, yes. So the current account. So there's the 4 accounts. Now, basically, the capital account is really tiny. We almost don't even have to worry about it. But the 2 important ones are the current account and the financial account. The statistical discrepancy is just a balancing item. It isn't really an account of its own. So really, these are the 2 we want to focus on. This is where we find the trade in goods and services, plus the income receipts. Down here, we find the financial flows where investments take place. Okay, so that's really what we want to focus on. So the balance of payments incorporates the trade balance here, but it also includes net income receipts, which we've been looking at. And in fact, I believe they have their own separate category for that here. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong chart or table. Here it is. There's the current account balance right there. So in other words, you can see the trade deficit is minus 579,937, but some of that is offset by our surplus in the net income receipts. So the current account balance is a little bit less, well, the deficit is a little bit smaller. It's still a deficit any way you look at it, but it's a little bit smaller because we did at least earn a surplus in the net income area, which I summarized over here somewhere. And so, yes, net income receipts, trade deficit. Now, also, there's a third category here called net unilateral transfers. Those are basically gifts, like foreign aid, for example, falls into that category. And that one, that would be, I believe, this one. It's a fairly small category. But the bottom line is that what you're essentially seeing here in the capital account, or current account rather, is the trade balance plus the net income receipts, and then some of these unilateral transfers. All of this collectively is referred to as the current account. It's a somewhat broader measure of our international exposure than the trade deficit. All right. And also, if you look very carefully in here, some of these items are negative. Positive usually means something's flowing into the country, and negative usually means it's flowing out. All right, let's see, what else do we need to know? Okay, let's jump ahead a little bit here. Now, the current account balance, as you can see, as we just mentioned, equals net exports plus our net income receipts plus the net unilateral transfers. Now, in this book, because this number is typically fairly small, the authors will usually just ignore the net unilateral transfers and essentially treat the current account balance as the net income plus, or in other words, sorry, not a net income, trade balance or net exports, and then the net income receipts. They're sort of glossing over this one because it's usually a very small percentage of the total. Just to keep things simple, they're going to treat the current account balance as simply the sum of net exports and net income receipts. There it is. You'll see why. Now, the reason why they're doing this is so that they can create what they call the GNP identity, where again, we have GDP equals these 4 terms. And then, as you know, GNP is defined as GDP plus the net income receipts. So what they do here is they rewrite this as GNP by incorporating the net income receipts. And then you see what they've done. They've replaced net exports plus net income receipts with the current account balance. And so while this will be our GDP identity, the book will frequently use this GNP identity. And the only real difference here is that the net exports or trade balance has been replaced by net exports plus net income receipts, which they're calling the current account balance. Now, of course, you can see there's some inaccuracy here, but it is a pretty good approximation to the actual values of GDP and GNP. Now, a lot of the models that they will develop in this book are based on the impact of various variables on GNP, like changes in interest rates, changes in exchange rates. The authors of this book love GNP. So we're going to see a lot of it in this book. All right. The capital account, very small account. It has a few highly specialized transactions. Oh, like the transfers of real estate, government forgiveness of foreign loans, miscellaneous. It's really like a miscellaneous account, just to capture things that don't really belong to the other categories. In fact, where is it? I had it listed here. I saw it here before. Here it is. Capital transfer receipts and other debits. Now look how small these numbers are. These are pretty small by comparison with the rest of them. So it's not that we should ignore it, but we don't have to pay a whole lot of attention there. Now, this is an interesting one, the financial account. What's going on in here? Well, we're looking at U.S. Now, these are financial assets like stocks and bonds. U.S. assets held abroad and by the way, they do not include financial derivatives in these numbers. They're listed separately. Yeah, there it is. Liabilities excluding derivatives. And those are listed down here somewhere. Yeah. It's almost like they wish those would go away, but they're trying to count actual flows for investments. The derivatives, the logic here is that derivatives are typically used for hedging purposes anyway. So they just want to capture the flow of funds to buy or sell foreign or domestic assets. So we're going to have U.S. assets held abroad, net of derivatives, foreign-owned assets in the United States, net of derivatives, and then these will get their own separate category. We can't ignore them, but we will treat them as if they were separate entities because the motivation for holding them is very different. We hold U.S. assets or foreign assets in order to make a rate of return of some kind. These are typically used, like I said, for hedging purposes. Okay. Now, within these categories, we have private assets, meaning that these are done by individuals. Foreign direct investment. Now, here we make a distinction between financial assets like stocks and bonds. Foreign direct investment usually means that you're investing in physical goods, or like, for example, if you start up, let's say Starbucks opens up a new branch in Paris, that's considered to be foreign direct investment because it's not stocks or bonds, but it is an asset. A Starbucks store is an asset, but it's a physical asset, not a financial asset. Or if we buy out a foreign business, like let's say Starbucks buys out a coffee shop in Paris, or if we build a factory to produce our products there, that's foreign direct investment. So we make a distinction here because portfolio investment can shift in and out of the country very, very quickly. It's easy to sell stocks and bonds. The foreign direct investment is a very long-term investment. It's not easy to close it down and sell it at a moment's notice like the portfolio investment is. So this is one of the motivations for treating these as two separate categories. Now, we also have government assets. The government owns a lot of assets, as it turns out. In the US and in other countries, those get listed separately because they don't belong to private companies. And then US official reserve assets, this is where you would find things like gold that is held by the central bank and other types of assets. These normally are the assets of, in our case, the Federal Reserve System. And then foreign investment. So US foreign direct investment means either American companies buy foreign firms or we hold other real assets like property or buildings or other types of real assets instead of foreign financial assets. Foreign use portfolio investment means stocks, bonds, bank deposits, you name it. As long as it's a financial asset, that falls into the category of US portfolio investment. Government assets, these are assets held by the US Treasury and different government agencies, not in private hands. And official reserve assets, they're held by the central bank, which is the Federal Reserve System. And this could include things like gold, foreign assets like foreign currencies. And these are used for the purpose of hopefully in some cases stabilizing foreign currencies or making transactions with other central banks. Okay, then everything works in reverse with foreigners. Foreigners own private assets in the US. They invest directly in the United States. There's a lot of foreign companies that work in the United States. And that, like, for example, if, I'm trying to think of a foreign food chain. But let's say there's a foreign restaurant that buys up a restaurant in New York City, that could be considered foreign direct investment. Portfolio investment means that foreigners are buying American stocks and bonds or possibly keeping their money in American banks. And of course, foreign governments own US assets as well. In fact, a lot of foreign governments own a lot of US Treasury bonds and bills because we owe so much money to these countries. And of course, foreign central banks also hold reserves like gold and foreign currencies. All right. Then we have net financial derivatives. And of course, financial derivatives are bought and sold by Americans. And so finally, the financial account balance includes all three of these. We add together our net. And of course, in these cases, the word net means domestic minus foreign. Net portfolio investment, net financial derivatives, all that is lumped together into this category called the financial account balance. Now, typically, the United States has a surplus in this account. Let's see how that we did last year. So they're saying here that the balance in the current account is here. The balance in the capital account is here. See, it's set up a little strangely. Yeah, let's see. Let's see if we can figure out. This is where we bought foreign financial assets, which are broken down into direct, meaning stocks and bonds and that kind of thing. I'm sorry, that's this one. This would be foreign businesses. This is stocks and bonds. And these are the reserve assets. So this is our incurrence of liabilities. So in other words, it looks like the balance here is the difference between this one and this one. Wow, so it looks like we do have a deficit here. Wow, oops. Wow, I don't know. They've made it very confusing, that's for sure. Let me just see if these add up properly. 358,971 minus 758, 291. No, that can't be right. I think it's the other way around. Because if we've incurred a liability, that means we have cash coming into the country. I think it's the other way around. If we take the 758, 291 and subtract 358, 971, that gives us a surplus of 399. Let me write this over here somewhere. So this would be the financial account. And according to my calculations, I'm showing it as a surplus of 399, 320. And then the current account balance is, of course, a deficit. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is because they're supposed to add up. The current account balance is actually listed here. There it is. It's a deficit. It's a huge deficit. Now, we also have the capital account balance, which is very, very small. It's almost not worth mentioning. All right. So that number, it's listed here separately as well. There it is. Okay, it's a small deficit. All right, here we go. Now, here's the interesting one. Those are the three basic accounts. We also have this other category called the statistical discrepancy. Where is it? There it is. Now, what is that all about? Well, I'll tell you what that's all about. Hold on one second. We're going to add these up. And you can see it's not zero, but it's very close. The idea here is that the statistical discrepancy is what we need to make these three numbers balance out. In other words, these three, in principle, are supposed to add up to zero. And when they don't, we have the statistical discrepancy, which is supposed to bring it into balance. Now, here it looks like it's off a little bit. I'm not quite sure why, but that's what it's doing there. Because the reality is, it's hard to gather this information, and frequently mistakes are made, or sometimes mistakes are made. And so this essentially is a recognition of errors that were made in the creation of these numbers. All right. And so in effect, so that's why I said it was a fudge factor, which is designed to force these three accounts to add up to zero or as close to it as possible. Okay, let's see. Wait a minute now. I just noticed something. Let me just check this out for a second. See, the thing is that it's so strange. They don't actually have a separate listing for the balance in the financial account. Oh, here it is. It's just so strangely worded. They're claiming that this represents the sum of both the current and capital account balances. Let me just check that out. So is this true? No, not really. That's very strange. And then this, it looks like it must be the financial account. And then we'd have here a statistical discrepancy. So, okay. They're claiming that this first number, oh, they can't all be negative, can they? This is supposed to be the current and capital account. And this is the financial account. And then this one is the statistical discrepancy. So presumably, oh my God. All right, well, let's get rid of this negative. Let's see what happens. I'm going to add these up, and they're supposed to add up to 0. And they do. All right, so I don't know how or why this is happening, but these numbers don't really match these. They must have added other categories. Like, for example, it must be the case that this one includes everything except the financial derivatives. And this one, as we know, does not include the unilateral transfers. So what they must have done is they must have added those at the end. And that's what they ended up with. So these are the actual numbers that we should be looking at. Like I said, very, very confusing, some of these categories. I don't understand their thinking when they set it up this way. But this is what we're stuck with. And so these are deficits. This is a surplus, as we usually have. And this accounts for the gap between them. And so we end up with 0 as our sum. It's supposed to be, well, it's supposed to be 0, but there's some rounding going on there. So it's pretty clear. So somehow or other, they derived. Now, there is an explanation in here. They're telling us, for example, this one is 67. Oh, I see. This is what I used. This is what I took to be the, okay, they took that line. And then they subtracted 91, which I did. But then they also brought in line 107. Okay, there you go. That explains that. That's why this number is wrong, because I did not include the financial derivatives. Now, for the current account balance, how they calculated that, they are saying that we should have taken line 109, balance on the current account, but then we should have added back in the balance in the capital account. Well, I guess that's kind of what we did. I don't know. I'll look into this later on. I mean, it's a little bit weird, but at least we know these are adding up. And so the whole point of all this is that they're supposed to add up to 0. And because they usually don't, that's why that statistical discrepancy is there. All right. Well, anyway, so what else do we need to say about this? There's several reasons why there's this statistical discrepancy. First of all, the balance of payments data comes from multiple sources. Sometimes we can't find out what we need to know about capital flows because of privacy concerns. In fact, I mean, because these are all private transactions. And of course, here's a big issue. What is missing from this data are small transactions that are, very small transactions and illegal transactions. No crooks are going to report their activity to the government. So we're going to miss them all. And of course, that means we're going to have problems. And of course, there's always a possibility of just straight ahead human error. All right. So now, here's what we want to look at. We want to think about how the balance of payments are affected by some of these variables. For example, GNP, growth of the economy, exchange rates, interest rates, and inflation rates. This is just a brief overview of how these different categories in the balance of payments are affected by these macroeconomic variables. We'll be looking at more of this in later chapters. So GNP, as GNP rises, domestic citizens spend more money on all goods and services, including imports. but our exports are not affected by our own domestic growth. So the faster our economy is growing, in all other things being equal, the worse will be our trade deficit and our current account balance. Now, we've already had this discussion before. So in a way, this is kind of working against us. More rapid growth will actually harm our trade deficit because we'll buy more from foreigners when we have more wealth. But at the same time, though, they will not necessarily buy more from us. Now, the exchange rate, we'll be talking about this a lot throughout the course, as you can imagine. But the bottom line is, having a weak dollar actually helps the trade deficit because imports become too expensive for Americans to buy, or more expensive, and our exports become cheaper to foreigners. So a weak dollar actually helps our trade deficit. On the other hand, if the dollar gets stronger, then we're going to have the opposite situation. A strong dollar is bad for the current account balance. A weak dollar is good. Now, that doesn't mean it's good for the economy, but as far as the trade balance goes, a weak dollar is helpful and a strong dollar is harmful. So here's a quick numerical example that illustrates this. Suppose we have a US importer that's buying 100,000 bottles of Bordeaux from France, obviously, at 30 euros per bottle. If we're currently seeing an exchange rate of $1.30 per euro, that means we'll have to pay $3.9 million for those bottles. And then we hopefully will sell them at a profit in the United States. If the dollar gets weaker, by which we mean it takes more dollars to buy a euro, all of a sudden we have to pay $4.2 million for those bottles. And that means, in general, since Bordeaux is more expensive in the United States, we'll buy less French Bordeaux, and that will reduce our imports, which will help the current account balance. But on the other hand, if in France, a French importer is buying 100,000 bottles of California Chardonnay at $30 each, if the exchange rate is $1.30, the cost will be approximately 2.307 million euros. And again, suppose that the dollar gets weaker. It depreciates up to $1.40. And again, we'll see a lot of this in the coming weeks. The new cost to the French firm is only 2.14 million euros instead of 2.3 million euros. So in other words, we're going to sell more Chardonnay in France because the dollar is weaker. We're going to buy less French Bordeaux. So our imports will fall, but our exports to France will go up because from their perspective, the Chardonnay is now cheaper. So the net effect is that our trade balance will improve because the dollar is weaker. And of course, the opposite will happen if the dollar gets stronger. Okay. Interest rates, what does this have to do with anything? Well, when our interest rates go up, our financial assets like stocks and bonds become more attractive to investors around the world. They will therefore respond by buying more US stocks and bonds. That will mean US interest rates will go up. And but it also means that our financial account balance goes up, and it means that we'll have a surplus in the financial account, which will help with the balance of payments. All right. If our interest rates fall, people will take their money out of the United States, and then that will reduce the balance in our financial account. And then finally, inflation rates. Inflation is bad news for a country. People do not want to invest their money in a country that has a lot of inflation. So therefore, if our inflation rate goes up, people will stop investing so much money in the United States, and they may also buy less US products. So therefore, our current account deficit might get worse, and our financial account balance will certainly get worse. So that's bad news, okay? All right, well, anyway, so all of this was meant to be a brief introduction to the area of the balance of payments. Now, we're not going to spend so much time looking at accounting issues in future chapters. In fact, right off the bat in chapter 14, we're going to start looking at, let's see, what are we looking at in chapter 14? Oh boy. Well, you know what? I'll find it in my files. Chapter 14, which will start next week, we're going to start right off the bat by looking at the foreign exchange market. And I think you'll find this to be an extremely interesting discussion. And so we're going to be looking at, oh boy, do we have a lot of interesting things to do next week. And there's a certain amount of math and there's a lot of graphs, and this will be a lot of fun. So just remember, this week we had to look at this accounting data and understand some of these definitions, but going forward, we'll primarily be looking at more theoretical discussions about exchange rates, their impact on the economy, et cetera, okay? So don't be put off by all of this accounting stuff. It's not going to be like this for the rest of the course. Anyway, so are there any last minute questions? If not, I think we'll say good night, and I'll see you all again next week.
Have a good night, Professor.
All right, good night.
Take care,
Good night.
Professor.
Hey,
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
bye.
Thank you.
Okay, see you later.